Welcome back, everyone. Get ready to dive into the early Islamic world with us today. We're checking out excerpts from Michael A. Cook's A History of the Muslim World for this deep dive.
Oh yeah, this is a good one.
It really is. I mean, in just a century, Islam goes from this small group in Arabia to a massive empire. We're going to be talking about empires crumbling, cultures blending in fascinating ways.
It's a wild ride for sure.
Yeah.
And it's less about the conquest, I think, than people picture in their heads, and more about the birth of a new civilization interacting with all these existing ones.
It really makes you think, like, what if just a few things had gone differently early on? Would the world even look the same today?
Right, gets crazy.
It really is. So Cook starts by painting this picture of Arabia before Islam, and it wasn't some superpower waiting to happen. Think about it. A place where even having a government was pretty rare. Mostly it was tribes, many of them struggling for basic resources, never mind building empires.
And geographically, Arabia was a tough one to control. Cook even points out that, Egypt was fertile, easy to rule, good for a tax collector. Arabia. Scattered oases, not exactly ideal for a would-be empire. The fact that such a vast empire did emerge is pretty wild when you think about it.
Totally. And we can't forget the Kaaba. That was already there, the central holy site, but it was pagan, not Islamic at the time.
Right, Islam didn't just wipe the slate clean, it built on what was there. Like, Cook talks about Arab queens and women having some freedom in pre-Islamic Arabia. A stark contrast to later, of course, but
Yeah.
makes you wonder, how much did that old Arabia shape what the new Islam became?
Such an interesting question. So now let's bring in Muhammad. His message was about monotheism, but not just a general one-God idea. He linked it right back to Abraham, put it in an Arab lineage.
And that's huge for why it resonated, I think. Suddenly, you're not just worshiping the same God, you're part of a shared history with Jews and Christians. And here's where it gets really interesting. Cook mentions these copycat prophets after Muhammad. People were trying to recreate his success, which shows just how powerful his message was. This wasn't just about conquest. This was about a whole new way of thinking taking hold.
And that spread was crazy fast in those early years. Muhammad goes from preaching to leading a state that controls most of Arabia within his lifetime.
He was a smart leader, too. Combined political authority with the religious. He'd delegate tasks, but never let anyone get too powerful, always kept control.
Like at the Battle of Badr, Cook describes how Muhammad was planning the battleground, and one of his companions was like, "Hey, are you sure about this location?" Muhammad listens, rethinks it, and bam, victory. It shows he was willing to adapt as he went, not just some unyielding ruler.
And that lack of a clear successor, it really had an impact later on. No single person had that same power after Muhammad. There were disagreements, power struggles. Makes you wonder, was that instability just baked in from the beginning?
Right. So then things go beyond Arabia. Persia, Egypt, huge chunks of the world under Muslim rule in decades. It's unbelievable how fast that happens. But there's a pattern to it too. They conquer Persia, but Anatolia barely touched it first. Why is that?
This is where Ibn Khaldun comes in, the historian. He argued it wasn't just about Arab armies being strong. Geography, who was already in power elsewhere, it all mattered.
They went for weak points, right? Like
Yeah.
Iraq was the Sasanian capital, conquer that, the whole empire is vulnerable. But the Byzantines, they were smart. That capital was far off in Anatolia. Losing Egypt, Syria, that hurt, but it didn't destroy them entirely.
And here's another thing. How do you even manage all these conquests? They had the stipend system. Instead of just giving land to conquerors, they got salaries, kept the army loyal, stopped powerful guys from grabbing land, but also created this divide, conquerors versus conquered. You can see the tensions brewing already.
And we have to acknowledge, Cook brings up how Muslim sources and non-Muslim sources, they don't always agree.
Oh yeah, like with Arwad and Khuzestan, depending on who's telling the story, it's night and day. Really shows how we have to think critically about history. Who wrote it and why?
It's like a puzzle, but with some pieces missing forever. Speaking of putting things together, let's talk about this early caliphate.
It's important to remember that this early caliphate, it's not some fixed thing. It was changing constantly, always debating. Who leads? How do we run this massive empire?
Sounds like a tough job, right? Like Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, these early caliphs, they're trying to balance the religious ideals with, the reality of running an empire.
A total balancing act. And you've got power struggles, assassinations, different factions popping up. Look at Muawiyah, for example. Civil war's been raging, and he takes control, basically establishes a dynasty. That's a huge shift.
Sets the stage for the Umayyads, right, and they hold on, despite their own infighting, for almost a century.
And those fights weren't small potatoes. This was about who has the right to rule. What does Islam even mean in this crazy changing world? Big questions.
Cook even says that sometimes religious talk, it was just a cover, not always about being pious, but about grabbing power, playing politics.
Exactly. History's messy, never black and white. It's about motivations, how people use ideas, whether it's religion or something else, to get what they want.
Fascinating stuff. And speaking of power, here come the Abbasids, and they basically tell the Umayyads, you're out. Shifts the whole center of the Muslim world from Damascus to Baghdad.
Talk about a shakeup. The Abbasids, they were smart. They tapped into this idea of going back to the true Islam, got people on their side. And they learned from the Persians, adopted their administration style, made the state more centralized, more complex.
Strategic, for sure. But even they had problems, right? Revolts, different sects, powerful families in the provinces causing trouble. Never a dull moment.
But amidst all that chaos, something new emerges. A distinct Islamic civilization. Arabic. It explodes. Becomes the language for government, for scholarship, for literature.
Cook even says that Jews, Christians, they started using Arabic. It's like the common thread tying this diverse world together.
Total cultural fusion happening. Arabs, Persians, Greeks, Indians, their traditions are mixing, influencing each other, and boom, something totally new is born.
But not always smooth sailing, right? Like Cook talks about these Egyptian documents. The Arabs, at first they just kept using the old Byzantine system, but then a switch, they deliberately go for Arabic, emphasizing their own identity.
Makes you think, you know?
Yeah.
How do you balance fitting in with holding on to who you are? It's a question we still ask today.
That's so true. And it wasn't just in Egypt, was it? This whole early Muslim world, Oman, North Africa, Spain, everyone's trying to figure out this new reality, blending old and new in their own ways.
And those different paths, they led to conflict too. Look at the Berbers in North Africa. Convert to Islam? Sure. Bow down to Arab rule? Not so much. They joined these Kharijite movements, even made their own states, this whole blend of Berber and Islamic identity.
They were like, Islam, yes, but on our terms.
Exactly. That's what's so cool about this period, this back and forth unity, them breaking apart. It's always moving. It's not just about empires. It's about people building new societies, new ways of life. It's fascinating.
We can't forget all the exploring that's going on now, too. Like Ibn Battuta, Cook talks about him. He goes to Oman, East Africa, gives us these snapshots of life all over, bustling port cities, isolated mountain communities, you name it.
Like reading a time traveler's diary. It really gives you a sense of how connected everything was. People, goods, ideas, flowing across continents, new relationships forming. It's amazing.
Though there were definitely limits, Islam spreads all along the East African coast, but inland, not so much.
Yeah, geography played a big part there. Most of East Africa was tough to reach by land. Think dense forests, rough terrain, way easier to stick to the trade routes than venture into the unknown.
Plus, as Cook points out, the interior didn't really have much to offer empires looking for, riches and power.
Exactly, and it highlights something really important, this whole idea of trade and economics driving things. Islam spread most effectively along those trade networks. They connected the world, created opportunities for merchants, rulers, everybody.
So it's not just about religion, it's about money, politics, the whole package.
100%. Religious expansion, it's often tied up with those things. It's about understanding the motivations, how different tools, religion, economics, military might, they're all used to reach those goals.
It's like everyone's trying to outmaneuver each other, build their power, but the ground is always shifting. Kind of makes you think about how we got to where we are today.
Totally. And just when you think you've got a handle on things, bam, the Turks enter the scene, changed the entire game.
Right. And they weren't just some nomadic group either. Cook makes it clear they had a whole culture, laws, this idea of Quasaklik even. What was that all about?
Oh, it's fascinating. So Quasak, at first it meant something like a lone wolf, someone breaking away from the pack. But then it became the word for these Turkic warriors who are out there carving their own little empires, often by taking on the big guys. Imagine like a Central Asian version of feudal Europe, constantly shifting power on the steppes.
Wow, so even within empires, there's always this power struggle happening. But the Turks, they weren't just disrupting things, they built stuff too. The Seljuks, they took Persia, parts of Anatolia, created a whole new dynasty.
And they weren't just conquerors either. These guys were patrons of the arts, scholarship, the whole deal, building mosques, libraries, madrasas. Their reign helped spread Persian culture and language all over. It reminds you that empires aren't just about military power, but also about ideas, culture, connections.
It's amazing how interconnected everything was becoming. But then, the Mongols. Talk about a reset button on history. Genghis Khan and his hordes just swept through Asia, leaving destruction in their wake. Really makes you think about the brutality of it all.
It was a crazy time, for sure. But even with all that destruction, things settled into a new kind of order. The Mongols, they were ruthless, no doubt, but also surprisingly practical as rulers. They incorporated local customs, let local elites keep some power. It was less about forcing their culture and more about keeping things running, making sure the wealth kept flowing.
And they were pretty open to different religions, too, weren't they? Cook mentions Genghis Khan consulting with Buddhist monks, Christian priests, Muslim scholars. Seems like he wanted to understand all the different angles.
Yeah, it's a good example of how empires, even the ones built on conquest, they can actually help spread culture, connect people. The Mongols might have been violent, but they also brought goods, ideas, people from all over. They kind of accidentally created this big cultural melting pot.
And when their empire broke apart, that's when you get these new powers rising up. The Ottomans in Anatolia, the Timurids in Persia, the Mamluks in Egypt, each with their own story.
Oh, absolutely. The Ottomans are a perfect example. Tiny state at first, then boom, they're everywhere. Conquered Constantinople, became a major power, like the power, in Europe and the Middle East for centuries.
They were incredible at running things, weren't they? Cook mentions this, how they made a centralized, efficient state, used the Turkish language and culture to unify their empire, even though it was so diverse.
They were good, but even they had their limits. Power struggles within the empire, money troubles, new rivals popping up. Just like the empires that came before, they eventually declined. It's a reminder that nothing lasts forever.
A cautionary tale for sure. Then there's Timur, or Tamerlane, as some people call him. He's like the Genghis Khan archetype, this brilliant military mind, utterly ruthless, but also a lover of art, a builder of cities. How do you even wrap your head around that?
Right, Timur is all about contradictions. Devout Muslim, responsible for tons of deaths, wanted to rebuild the Mongol Empire, but also built Samarkand, this beautiful city. He really shows how complex historical figures can be.
And his empire, it was huge, but also kind of fragile, held together by his personality, basically. So when he dies, boom, everything falls apart. Chaos, instability, the whole deal.
Yeah, it fell apart quickly, but from that mess, some really important cultural centers in the Islamic world were born. The Timurids, even though they weren't around that long, really encouraged art and learning. Miniature painting, poetry, science, all of it flourished under their rule. Proof that even destruction can lead to creation.
It all comes back to that, doesn't it? This cycle of history. And of course, we can't forget about the Mamluks. They ruled Egypt for centuries, these elite slave soldiers. Military power, luxurious lifestyles, really powerful networks. Definitely not to be messed with.
They were a force to be reckoned with. Defeated the Mongols, the Crusaders even. Left behind these incredible mosques, madrasas, hospitals. They were major players, no doubt.
But just like everyone else, they had their weaknesses. Internal power struggles, economic problems. Then the Ottomans show up. In the end, they couldn't escape history either. They accomplished a lot, but their rule wasn't without its problems, to say the least.
And so we come to the end of our trip through these early centuries of Islam. We've seen empires rise and fall, cultures clash and combine, and people who change the course of history with their actions. It's a story full of big dreams, new ideas, and yeah, a lot of conflict. Really gets you thinking about all the what-ifs, you know?
It's been an amazing look into a really complex part of history, a period that most people probably don't understand very well. We saw how amazing humans can be, creating things, connecting, building, but also how destructive we can be, how fleeting power really is. Makes you wonder, what will our legacy be? How will people in the future see the choices we're making today?
Now there's something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, everyone. Catch you next time.